My name is Linda Pantel. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Programming here at UChicago, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our final session of Career Month. Our final, but certainly not the least. I am very excited about this session. It's been a great joy working on it with Kristen. Lots of good stories, and I'm excited to hear more of them come out today. And I think my favorite childhood story was a book called Paper John, about a boy who can create anything out of paper. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn the controls over to Kristen.
Yay, thank you, Linda. So yes, definitely, as people are coming on, I put it in again, please introduce yourself in the chat. I think it's tons of fun to know where people are coming from, your name, your location, and we're sharing our favorite childhood book or bedtime story too today. So please chime in. And I'm literally getting visuals, like Mike Mulligan and the Steam Shovel, totally can see the book cover of that book, right? I will admit some of them I probably remember in part because I read them again to my daughter, right? So they're even more recent than my childhood. So yeah, keep those childhood books and bedtime stories coming. Okay, so let's imagine together that we are at a UChicago alumni event in person. You've all been there, you've all done it. This one that we're all at is in 2001. And it's actually the first time since our daughter was born that I am headed out of the house in professional clothes to hang out with other grown-ups with my husband, who's also an alum. And you know the drill, right? You get in the room, I have my wine glass, I have my little plate of cheese, and the first person comes along and the inevitable question is, so what do you do? Well, I'd always had an answer to this question. Something along the lines of, oh, I'm a director of training at Earthlink. But in that moment, I was like in a deer in headlights because I did not have an answer. And so I responded and I said, well, actually, I'm at home taking care of our 4-month-old. And the person looked at me and said, oh, isn't that nice? And then they turned to my husband and said, so David, what kind of law are you practicing? This person literally probably had whiplash from how fast they ignored me. And I was not happy about it. I sulked pretty much the rest of the night and probably into the next day or two. And it made me question all of it because I realized I wasn't willing to introduce myself in a way that left out what was at the time the biggest part of my life. But it also, in hindsight, made me realize even my previous answer didn't really communicate the whole me very well. So I decided to start experimenting with answers. And first I tried a list. I would say to people, well, I'm a mother and I used to be a teacher, and then I was a manager of training at Earthlink. But you know what? Lists were boring. They were boring to listen to, and they were boring to me when I was listing them out for people. And so then one day I was talking to a friend of mine about a leadership team that I'd coached in the past. And I joked to her, I was like, well, it's not all that different than teaching preschoolers to get along with each other. And she laughed. And I was like, aha, maybe there's something there that I can work with. So for a while during that part of my life, when people would ask me, what do you do? I would say, well, most of the time I spend teaching a very small person how to get along with other people. But I also help grown-ups learn how to get along with each other. Guess which one pays more? And then, depending on the context, I would tell a story about one or the other pieces of my life. And I ended up concluding that what was much more important than mastering one story or one answer about myself was mastering a process that I could return to over time for crafting a collection of stories that would evolve along with me. And that's what I'm hoping to leave you with today, is that process that you can use to craft stories that evolve along with you. So let's dive in a little bit. In terms of norms for the day, just real quickly, please feel free to use the chat. It won't distract me. Linda's on the chat. She's going to drop in some links for us. I actually have a Google Doc that she's going to drop in that gives sort of all the key points for today, along with some links to some tools. so that you don't feel like you have to take notes. You can pull it up and follow along. Please drop questions into the chat. We're going to have time for questions. We want this to be super interactive, so we've built in a ton of sort of practice and engagement time. And then let's also agree that the stories that get told here stay here, unless of course you're the storyteller, you own the story. And also that this is a learning space and an experimental space. I'd like us all to try to set aside for a little while what I consider to be that certificate for an inferiority complex that comes along with the University of Chicago degree, you know, the one that says you must think that everybody else around you is doing something more amazing and more impressive than you are. You don't have to impress anybody today. Let's make this a learning space for each other. Now, a few years ago, I made a decision to apply to give a TEDx. And then I promptly panicked when I was selected and had to figure out how to give one. So I hired a coach. His name is John Bates. And I still remember the first time I met with him in his office. I handed him a stack of papers. I was very excited. I said, okay, so here are all my facts and figures and all the things they need to know about unconscious bias. And he was very nice. He was patient and let me finish. And then he handed the stack of papers back to me and said, if you go up there and spout all these facts, this will be the most boring TEDx ever. I was like, well, okay, that's definitely not what I'm going for. He said, I'm going to give you my first bit of coaching advice. Never make a point without a story or tell a story without a point. And he said, Kristen, any point on those pieces of paper that doesn't connect to a story that helps you make it has got to go. And I'm like, but look, they're so pretty and they're all important. And I did so much work to find them. And he just shook his head at me. So I was trying to be a good coachee. So I, switched gears and started trying to find all of the most compelling stories that I could tell that might connect to one of those points. It was very difficult. I had to cut a lot of darling facts. And even before I got to the stage, I realized, of course, that he was right, because I was rehearsing with my friends, and it was clear that the stories is what was sticking. The stories were making them laugh. The stories were what were making my point. And even today, a lot of people will tell me that they remember a story from my TEDx. Nobody mentions that they remember a fact or figure that I managed to slip in there, right? So I'm a total convert. Never make a point without a story or tell a story without a point. And that means if we want to tell stories about ourselves, we've got to really get good at telling tight, compelling stories that communicate a lot about us in a short amount of space. So that's what we're going to practice today. And I've got 3 things about stories that we're going to work on specifically. The first is that stories must have a beginning, middle, and end. We have the rhythm wired into our brains. Once upon a time, something happened. They lived happily ever after. Stories also have to have details that connect to our senses or our emotions. A few things that make people feel, hear, or see the story and make it sticky. However, stories should not have all of the details that are in your head or memory or on your pretty page of research. Your job as a storyteller is to curate the story with just enough details to make the point and nothing more. So, first bit of practice we're going to do. I'm going to tell you a story because effectively I just made 3 points. You guys are from the University of Chicago. You realize I just made 3 points without a story. Well, here comes the story. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a story and you're going to listen for those 3 things. Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Does it have details that connect to the senses and emotions? And does it leave out some obvious details that you don't really need to know to get the point? Feel free to chime in the chat. I'm happy to have, 100 coaches today, right? If I can make this story better, I'm all for it. So, and I definitely have a gardener next door. Linda and I were just talking about this, that like inevitable, you know, I told my gardeners not to come today, right? But I didn't tell the neighbor not to have his gardeners come today. So in 1987, I was a senior in high school and I worked on my first political campaign. My beloved English teacher, John Dorn, decided to run for the Minnesota State House of Representatives, even though everyone told him it was completely impossible to unseat the incumbent. So I volunteered and I was put in charge of lawn signs because I was an 18-year-old with an Apple II computer and a dot matrix printer, and I knew how to use a database to keep track of all the addresses of the people that had agreed to take lawn signs. So I spent that fall driving all over town with my best friend and, you know, walking through autumn leaves in the front yards of all the houses and putting up John Dorn lawn signs. And then the night of the election, sometime after midnight, we found out, and frankly, I don't even remember how we found out because there was no internet, that John Dorn had won that election by 68 votes. And my mom and I rushed over to the impromptu election party because they hadn't even expected to win, so that I could give Mr. Dorn a hug. And that tells you a lot about why I believe change is always possible, and that I'm the kind of person who's willing to either lead the change or be the one driving around town putting up lawn signs. All right. So let me pause there. I want to look in the chat. Did you hear things? Right? Feel free to chime in the chat. Did you hear details? What details did you hear? Did you hear a beginning, middle, and end? Were there details that you're like, oh, in hindsight, she could have included X or Y, but she didn't? Visual details about what I was experiencing, definitely, or like what you could see, right? Crunching leaves felt very visceral. Interesting too, I don't think I even said the word crunching, right? In my rehearsals, I have the word crunching, just so you know, but I didn't say it, and that's fascinating because you heard it anyway, didn't you? That's a great example. Yeah, the fall leaves, crunching, right? Right, the beloved teacher, right, leads up to wanting to give a hug, right? You could feel the emotion. A lot of us, you know, you're letting people identify with you. A lot of us have those beloved teachers, right? So it doesn't matter that you don't know who John Dorn is, right? Or where he is, you can share that feeling along with me. Yep, beginning as a senior, yep, the middle, the elections, and then the end, why you believe, sort of my point, right? Yeah, good, 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 good. Fall leaves seem superfluous, yes, right? I could probably have just said walking, I went around that fall walking through the leaves in the front yards, right? You wouldn't even have to say, you know, fall twice or whatever. Good. Yes, story also points to having a challenge or obstacle as part of the story. That's a really good point because at the middle of a story, you want, you know, overcoming a challenge or obstacle. A lot of times when we tell stories about ourselves, we're tempted to tell all the best bits that we want to brag about. But what people really connect to is the process, the way you got through an obstacle or a challenge. And so don't be afraid to include that in your story. Good. Well, part of this, as you know, as you can guess, is that I wanted you to practice listening for these things because pretty soon I'm going to ask you to practice telling your own stories and listening to each other for these things. Okay. So I want to get you busy right away. So we are going to first do an exercise where we're just going to individually brainstorm. In a few seconds, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to brainstorm, and you're going to brainstorm 2 lists. One list is stories you like to tell about yourself or that other people like to tell about you, right? And things you'd like other people to know about you. So a couple of guidelines before we brainstorm. Please, please, please mind both personal and professional stories. Don't limit yourself to professional stories. You never know where the best story is going to come from or when you're going to need a story. The second thing is, after today, totally encourage you to get outside of your own head and ask other people for stories that they remember about you. I actually included a link in the Google Doc. There's an article that walks through a really easy activity to go out and gather those stories and points from other people in your life. Okay, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes for 2 lists. I'm literally going to use my phone timer, and your one list is stories. Don't filter, all the stories you can think of. And the second list is things you want people to know about you. So everybody got a pen and a piece of paper or a document up on their screen? You're ready to get busy now? I mean, a lot of you, it has to be afternoon, right? So you should be awake and plenty of coffee, ready to go, right? All right, here we go. 2 minutes. Ready, set, go. So hopefully you have 2 lists, list of stories and a list of things you'd like people to know about you. So now your job is to pick just one pair, okay? One story and one point that you'd like to be able to make about yourself. There's no wrong answer today, right? You're just picking something, a story that might help you make one of those points. So it's total practice, total experiment. All you really need is a pair, one pair, to go into our breakout rooms to practice with, okay? And sometimes that can be hard. But so I'm giving you a little bit of time to think about pairing a story with a point. And then we're going to go into the breakout rooms to practice as soon as I give you the instructions. Now, I want to warn you, if you haven't done this before, when I work on a story, there is a very unpleasant amount of time where I am convinced that the story sucks and I'm convinced that I suck. I was literally just telling my husband 2 days ago when I was prepping for this, I was like, oh yeah, I'm at the point where I'm convinced all of the stories suck and I suck, but I know I'll get through it because I've done this before. So just, it's okay, push through it, right? I know you can do it. So here's the deal. We're gonna go into breakout rooms for probably about 20 minutes. And here's your job in the breakout rooms. One person at a time is gonna take a turn as a storyteller. One other person in the breakout room is going to be the timekeeper, and I literally want you to get out your phones to do the time. And timekeeper, you have a very important job because the storyteller is going to tell their story, but the timekeeper, your job is to flag them down and stop them at 2 minutes, because no matter what, because part of the goal here is for people to start to feel what 2 minutes feels like, right? So, and then you take turns. After the storyteller gets 2 minutes, they stop, even if their story isn't finished, and then take 2 more minutes for everybody else in the group to give a little bit of feedback. But the only feedback you can give is on the 3 things we're working on, right? Do you hear a beginning, middle, and end? Do you hear a couple of details that connect to senses or emotions? And did you hear any details that you actually didn't need in order to get it, right? All of this is in the Google Doc as well, so that you can follow along the directions once you get to the breakout room. And then you're going to take turns. So it's basically 4 minutes a person, right? 2 minutes for the storyteller to tell their story, timekeeper cuts them off, and then everybody else gets 2 minutes to say, oh, I heard a beginning and a middle, but not an end yet. You clearly didn't get to it. Or I noticed this detail that really stuck with me, or actually don't think you need X, Y, or Z, right? Okay. And obviously this is, something you can do with a friend over Zoom. It's a great activity, right? That you can just now go back and practice with somebody else that you know and practice that story. Tend to tell the same story. Need to practice using other storylines points. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, challenging and out of comfort zone. I'm always going for that. So that's good. So, a question. How does your approach to storytelling compare to the STAR paradigm? I don't know. You'll have to tell me what it is. Drop in a link and we'll see. A lot of what I talk about story comes from a couple of the resources that I put in the Google Doc. The book Resonate by Nancy Duarte, which is very much about how TEDx talks are crafted. And then also a book that I didn't link to, but I could add, by Lisa Crone called Wired for Story, where she translates all of sort of the neuroscience and how our brains are wired for story, and then how to craft stories that connect to those things we know about the human brain. So yeah, and great to know how other people hear what you say, right? Because other people listening to you are going to hear things that you don't and are going to think things are more compelling than you think, right? So, because you've told the story a million times. All right, so let's do this. We've got some time for questions, but I would love to see if there's somebody who's willing to volunteer to share their story with the whole room. We've got, a bunch of coaches here. If you're willing to volunteer, why don't you, raise your hand in the chat? Is that the easiest thing, Linda? Or yeah, we can't see the whole screen, all the screen. So, Made to Stick is a great book. Thank you, Joe, by the Heath brothers. Totally agree. That's on my shelf, and got all kinds of highlighters on it. And their books are great examples of stories told to make points. So is anybody out there willing to try their story a second time for us?
Use the little raise my hand feature in the bottom of the toolbar.
Come on, folks, free coaching, right? There we go, Joe, you ready? No.
I was just celebrating the free coaching idea. I get plenty of exposure with this, so I don't need to take up the slot.
Got it. Be careful what move you make on your Zoom screen or you will get volunteered, right?
Oh, I'm interested. What's your story, Joe?
All right. Well, I might not look like it, but I actually had a minority educational experience. Growing up, I was secularly homeschooled by my parents, who were activists and children of the 60s and thought they could do a lot better. And in a lot of ways, they were correct. It definitely taught me to be a critical thinker and to advocate for myself. But even with all that, I came away from it when it came time to go to college, doubting whether or not I belonged there, because I had never been to a school, essentially. And I thought, well, everyone around me knows better how to do it. They know what's going on, and I am clueless. And it made me feel kind of down on myself and like I didn't belong there. But luckily, I came across some really wonderful teachers who saw my potential and were able to show me how the skill that I had in science and mathematics. And I would ultimately get a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics, but my first math class at college was a remedial math class because I was a little behind. And so this experience taught me, I can summarize what I learned in college in 5 words, is that reality is a human construct. And what does my motto mean and how can you use it? It means that you are the architect of your own life experience and should not let anyone, and I mean anyone, limit what you can imagine yourself to be. That is the key to lifelong success and satisfaction.
Applause.
Yes, good applause.
Yes. So I'm curious, jump in the chat and I see the question. Joe is not a ringer. I'm super happy somebody just asked that, right?
No, that's right. Although I took Guy Rolnick's storytelling class and I've TA'd it. And so I'm interested in storytelling and coaching and things.
Yeah.
And so I'm not a ringer, but I've definitely had a lot of experience with it.
Yeah, doing this. Okay. So I'm curious, what did people hear? You can jump in the chat. And let me know, what did you hear? Did you hear a beginning, middle, and end? Did you hear some details that connected to you, either sensory wise or emotion wise? Were there details Joe included that you didn't need? Chime in, what did you hear? I definitely heard a beginning, right? Like taking back to the childhood, right? And I kind of liked how also, Joe, that you teased that beginning with you sort of the expect the unexpected, right? Might not look like it, but right. So you sort of had me hooked at the beginning with the beginning of your story in childhood, and that I'm looking forward to something unexpected, right, from the story. And then there's definitely a middle, right, because there's a challenge right? Somebody said definitely beginning, middle, and end. There's definitely a sort of a challenge in the middle that he defined that he had to figure out how to get through. And then here's another comment. I think there were 2 beginning, middle, ends. There was the larger story arc, right? And then you had your reality as a moral construct. You created new suspense. So sort of tying together the personal experience and then the arc of the larger story arc about that concept. I was hooked about the point and walked away inspired. I was hooked wondering about the point, right, and inspired. Excellent. So a couple of questions too coming in. How is this a 30-second story with a 2-minute time frame? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's very hard to get to 30 seconds, and I think 2 minutes is a better practice goal. I also think it's a more natural human time span, frankly. There are certainly times where you have to fit it into 30 seconds, and you can get that tight when you need to. I went for the 2-minute time frame for 2 reasons, so that we could practice on a more human sort of time scale, and because I actually think that's a more human period of time to tell a story in, right? So think about your context. We wanted to get you here, so we wanted to get you thinking 30 seconds. But I think 2 minutes for me is more in line with what is really possible. Okay, so I think we have some time for some other questions, right, Linda?
We do. Yeah. Please. I mean, Kristen has been so available and forthcoming answering any of these questions. So yes, please keep them coming. Seeing one from Yaniv now. We will take these as they come. I'll pick out a few, but certainly Kristen, if you see anything that draws your attention.
I see one I want to do right away. So,
perfect.
Yaniv asks, how do you stop saying ah, and and get rid of those filler words? So I'm in 10th grade. My teacher is Rich O'Brien, old wizened, teacher, been teaching high school for years. And the big assignment for your 10th grade year is to write a research paper and then give an oral presentation. Well, I got through mine fine, but my best friend was really struggling. And she knew that what he was going to do, and what he did with every kid that gave the presentation, is he sat in the back of the room while you presented in class, and he had a coffee can and a spoon. And every time you said or ah, he clanged the coffee can, right? And so she was deathly afraid of this. And so we spent like days in her backyard with her giving her presentation and me having a coffee can and a spoon and clanging the thing every time she said or ah. Listen, you can do that. So you can use a coffee can, right? You can watch your own tape, listen to your own audio recordings, have somebody else listen to you. There's sort of, it's one of those, keep practicing and listening to yourself. And that's the way to sort of get rid of it, right? There's sort of no shortcut. You can tell yourself not to do it, and still, unless you practice doing it over and over again without them and listening to yourself, because you don't even realize when you're saying it, it's hard to get rid of it.
That's great. I'm going to add one more tip on that. That is a really helpful thing to ask for feedback for and give other people the tools to help you. And it's as simple as, a work presentation or on a video call saying to somebody you trust, Kristen, I'm working on eliminating these filler words. If you hear anything, please let me know.
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So we're seeing some seconded and upvoted questions here. What advice do you have when you are introducing yourself at professional meetings?
Yeah, boy, I wish I had the exact answer. I think it depends a little bit on the context, right? I sort of believe in having 2 things ready. One that is the quick and dirty 30 seconds. My caveat there is, I would say, try to avoid a list, right? Include something personal in that 15 seconds, that you're doing. And then to also have that 90-second to 2-minute version that really is a story, right? Even if it's the simplest of stories, right? It doesn't have to be the 2 or 3 minute one. Stories can be very short. They can be, I remember reading once that the shortest short story ever written. Have you guys ever seen those 6-word short story competitions, right? And the one I will always remember, because it's a story in 6 words, is for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Right? I'm like, oh my goodness, right? That's a story in 6 words. So for introducing yourself in professional meetings, I think my best advice is to have 2 of those answers at 2 different time spans ready, and to practice them over and over again.
Great. Practice, practice. Specific question from Anne. I noticed that you always mention the full name of the teacher or other person in your stories. Is there a strategy behind that?
Yeah, there is. It's to establish character, right, in a story. You don't really need that many more details, right, about the person. But if you have a name, right, then you're thinking about Kristen and Mr. Dorn, right, or Kristen and Rich O'Brien, or whoever it is. So it's sort of to establish character. The one thing I will say is that, getting rid of the unnecessary details is really hard. And that's why I think running it with other people so that they can tell you, oh yeah, it really landed with me that this or that, but you really didn't need these other things. This is another place where having other people listen to you will help you hone which are the details that make it stick and which are the ones that I can leave out.
Great. And our last question of the afternoon, can you give us examples, either, just what kind of stories? You can tell us just the topic that you are telling in 15 seconds and 2 minutes. How do you differentiate those topics?
So, the story that I told about the political campaign is a pretty good example of the 2-minute version, right? And I tend to tell stories like that. And that's one that I used recently for a particular purpose. The 15-second one, I've been playing around with a few of them now because, it's also the pandemic has changed things as well, right? And trying to figure out how to communicate to people what I do. The 15-second version that I've been working on recently and isn't polished is basically that I'll try to tell it and you guys can tell me. When our daughter was in preschool, everybody told us she couldn't go to our local public schools because they were awful. And we were not willing to accept that for an answer. So we gathered a bunch of people together and started visiting our public schools and realizing that if we made it easier for other people to visit schools, they would understand that our public schools were an option. And so I was gathering people, gathering information, pulling people together, and eventually we started a whole nonprofit to help other families do that. And in the end, that nonprofit is now a sustainable nonprofit that I haven't been directly involved in for 10 years. And that's really what I do. I tend to gather people together, help them step back so you can see things clearly and confront issues head on and then take action. I'm not sure it was 15 seconds, but it was, right? So it's like, how do you hone it to like the shortest of beginnings, the shortest of challenges, the shortest of here was the end, and close it with your point.
And I think what you're really demonstrating here is that this is an iterative process. As you just said, you are polishing the story currently. So that we are constantly working on these.
Yeah. And I also think too, let me share, I was working with a client recently on this process, and we are very prone to using the jargon that comes with our professional environments, right? And I couldn't get under the skin for her. Like somehow, like I just kept getting branding map this and product launch this and strategic and collaboration and right, like all those corporate buzzwords. And I knew this person well enough to know there were great stories that illustrated her resilience, which is the point she wanted to make. And I kept pushing and pushing. I'm like, come on, tell me a story. And she's like, okay, fine. And as a joke, she's like, maybe I should just tell the story about the ejecting chair. And I was like, yes, I want to hear the story about the ejecting chair. And she had this fabulous story about this product launch that went sideways because the chair they shipped to the department stores literally ejected people, right, from the chair when they sat down in it, and then how she responded and fixed it. And I'm like, you have to tell the story about the ejecting chair in your next job interview. Everybody will remember you, right? But she had to get below those layers of the jargon she thought she was supposed to, hand people in order to get to like the ejecting chair, which illustrated everything that she wanted to tell and was also memorable.
Kristen, I'm going to turn it over to you to close, and perhaps there might even be a little wrap in with our last question in the queue, which is, do you start with the point you want to make and find a story, or the other way around?
You know what? It's both and. It's a chicken and the egg kind of thing. I tend to use sticky notes and go, sticky note a whole, side of my wall with stories I love to tell, and sticky note a whole bunch of points I want to make, and then try to like match them up. And I do that anytime I need to speak, even if I'm just doing the 5-minute introduction at a nonprofit event. It's like, okay, stories, points, what works, go both directions. Okay, so I got to give you one last story, right? That seems only fair. So back when I was rehearsing for my TEDx, my coach also told me that I needed to practice. And as a former basketball player, that was something I understood quite well. So I would go out several times a week to my friends and invite them up to my living room to listen to me rehearse. I, of course, lured them with free coffee and donuts, and I would greet them at the door dressed in the dress that I was going to wear for the talk, with the shoes on that I was going to wear. And I'd do a full run through without stopping, no matter how much I sucked. And then later that day, I would go over the tape with my coach, minute by painful minute. And I was forcing myself to practice in game time conditions. And I want you to think about how you can do the same with the stories you've identified today, on how to practice in game time conditions can look like talking these stories out loud. Your spoken voice is very different than your written voice. You've got to talk them out loud. Watching your tape. I record myself on Zoom all the time and then watch the tape. Audio recording on your phone. I love to record myself on my phone. I don't love to. I do it. And then walk, right? And listen to the story and listen for what I want to do, what I want to change. So I want you to think about now, how do you practice under game time conditions? And when you get to tomorrow, I also want you to ask yourself, what do I remember from today? And my bet is that you're going to remember some of the stories. I'm going to remember a story about horses that I heard earlier today in the breakout rooms. And I also asked you to introduce yourself with your favorite story, because that's supposed to make a point too. That's what we remember. We remember those stories. We remember those visuals. And so hopefully tomorrow you also remember that you've now got a process that you can return to continually to craft a collection of stories that gets you remembered. That's my hope for you, and really glad you all joined today.